Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar series entitled Parallel Dreams, Korean and Korean American Issues Through Film, co-hosted by the Institute for Korean Studies at Indiana University and the Embassy of the Republic of Korea in the USA. My name is Seung-Kyung Kim. I am Korea Foundation Professor in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures and Director of the Institute for Korean Studies at Indiana University. First, I would like to thank Ambassador Lee Soo-hyuk for co-sponsoring the webinar series. I also would like to thank First Secretary Kim Jae-jung and Second Secretary Yoo So-young for working with us to make this event possible. At Indiana University, I would like to thank Dean Lee Feinstein for his leadership, Communication Director Jeanette Cummings for making the arrangements for streaming the documentary, and Assistant Director of the Institute for Korean Studies, Keith Seidel, for all his work to make the event go smoothly. In recent years, Korea has established itself as a mainstream cinematic powerhouse with films such as The Handmaiden, Train to Busan, the Oscar-winning Parasite, and the Oscar-nominated Minari becoming visible parts of American culture. This public lecture series features 3 film screenings and conversations with Korean American directors. The topics include transnational adoption, immigrant lives, and race issues. We kick off the series with Geographies of Kinship, and in the early fall, we will have events featuring Minari and another documentary, Saigu. Geographies of Kinship is a powerful film about the rise of Korea's global adoption program. The film examines universal questions of identity, assimilation, kinship, and belonging. I hope most of you have already watched the documentary. Tonight, we are presenting a moderated conversation featuring director Deann Borshay Lim and Professor Eleana Kim from the University of California, Irvine. I would like to introduce Professor Susan Hwang, who will moderate their conversation. Dr. Hwang is an assistant professor in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures at Indiana University. She specializes in contemporary Korean literature and culture, with a broader scholarly interest in cultures of protest in modern Korea, intellectual history, and translation studies. She is currently working on a book manuscript entitled Uncaged Songs, Culture and Politics of Protest Music in South Korea. It is a cultural history of South Korea's song movement that charts how songs became a powerful component of the struggle for democracy in South Korea during 2 of the nation's darkest decades, the 1970s and the 1980s. Please welcome Professor Hwang.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Susan Hwang, and I'll be moderating tonight's webinar. Following the discussion with our speakers, we will have a Q&A session with the audience. So at any point during the webinar, please use the Q&A tool to submit your questions for our speakers. And I predict that this webinar, first webinar of the series, will be a meaningful one, and hope that we can have a productive Q&A session as well, especially given that we have almost 300 people registered for tonight's event. We have 2 guest speakers with us tonight, filmmaker Deanne Borshay Lim and Dr. Elana Kim. Deanne Borshay Lim is the director, producer, and writer of the Emmy Award-nominated documentary First Person Plural, which premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in 2000, as well as award-winning documentaries in the matter of Cha Jung-hee and Memory of Forgotten War. A former director of the Center for Asian American Media, Director Borshay Lim was also nominated for an Emmy Award for outstanding achievement in the craft of directing. She has also served as the co-producer for documentaries Special Circumstances, Kelly Loves Tony, and AKA Don Bonus, a Sundance Institute Fellow and a recipient of a Rockefeller Film and Video Fellowship. Director Borshay Lim is currently working on their new upcoming film Crossings, which documents 30 leading women peacemakers on their historic journey to walk across the DMZ from North to South Korea. The other speaker we have tonight is Dr. Elana Kim. Dr. Kim is a cultural anthropologist at UC-Irvine. Her research and writing engage with issues of nature and culture and the biological and the social in the production of personhood and social value. Her scholarship to date explores the subjects of transnational adoption from South Korea, the ecologies of the demilitarized zone, and transnational circulations of medicinal ginseng, with relevant articles appearing in journals Social Text, Anthropological Quarterly, and Cultural Anthropology. Her award-winning first book, entitled Adopted Territory, Transnational Korean Adoptees and the Politics of Belonging, was published by the Duke University Press in 2010. In this book, Dr. Kim examines transnational transracial adoption from South Korea and addresses theoretical questions with respect to kinship and belonging in their contemporary entanglements with global capitalism, state power, and transnational processes. So welcome, Director Borshay Lim and Dr. Kim. It's really great to have you here with us today.
Thank you.
Yeah. So before we get into more specific questions pertaining to the topic for today's webinar, I thought we can start with a brief introduction from Director Borshay Lim, which can be followed by Dr. Kim on the history of transnational adoption as they pertain to adoptees from Korea.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, thank you, first of all, to Professor Kim for inviting us for this wonderful Parallel Dreams webinar. I really appreciate being here with everybody. I thought I would begin by actually telling you a little bit about my own story, because my own experience as an adopted individual, enduring and living through assimilation and identity struggles and so on are really part of an important part of my work as a filmmaker. So I'm going to share my screen and I hope it works. Okay. Oops. Cancel. Okay. Hang on a second. There. Can everybody see my screen? Just say yes, because I can't see anybody.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, so basically, I was adopted as well from South Korea at the age of 8 by an American family in California. And this is actually, oops, hang on a second, sorry. This is actually a picture of my adoptive mother and myself on the first day when we arrived home to Fremont, California. You can see me surrounded by these new toys, including a lot of blonde dolls. So my adoptive parents, Arnold and Deann Borshay, had 2 children, biological children, Duncan and Denise, and I became their youngest child. And when I arrived in the US, my documents indicated that my Korean name was Cha Jung-hee and that I was an orphan and that I had no family at all in Korea. I learned English very quickly, like a lot of adoptees I've talked with, and essentially forgot how to speak Korean and in fact developed complete amnesia about Korea, even though I was 8 years old. And I basically grew up in a predominantly white suburban community as kind of an all-American kid, very racially isolated, no people of color really in the community where I grew up. And the only thing I retained about my past was what my parents told me and what was really in my adoption documents, which was that I was an orphan and that I had been in an orphanage. So years later, I decided to search for my family, my birth family, to search for my roots. And during the last semester, when I was an undergrad at UC Berkeley, I made a shocking discovery. I did have a family in Korea, a mother and brothers and sisters, and a very large extended family. And I think most people have heard stories about babies switched at birth. That's kind of what happened to me. I was also switched, not at birth, but at the age of 8 with a girl that I had never met. So I discovered that my name was not Cha Jung-hee, it was actually Kang Ok-jin. And so discovering all of this, in my early 20s, turned my world completely upside down. Prior to this, I was, convinced that I was white like my American parents and my family, which is kind of a strange thing to think that I was white, but it turns out I wasn't alone actually. There was a study a number of years ago by an institute called the Evan B. Donaldson Adoption Institute that surveyed early generation of Korean adoptees. And I think around 78% of those surveyed said that they felt they were white or wanted to be white when they were growing up. And that pretty much describes my experience. So I knew nothing about Korea, the Korean culture or the Korean language, what it meant to be a Korean or an Asian person. I suddenly, in discovering my family in Korea, I was sort of at a loss as to what it meant and who I was or what I was. And I also realized that that my adoption, even though I was adopted by a loving family, that the adoption itself was forged in loss. I had lost a whole family, a nation, a language, a culture, the opportunity to grow up with Korean brothers and sisters, the opportunity, in fact, to grow up as a Korean. And I had even lost my memories, and which to me is the most tragic of all in some ways, not being able to remember anything. And I ended up just really depressed and confused and incredibly angry about everything. And so, of course, I decided to make a film about it. I actually ended up making 2 films. First person plural and In the Matter of Cha Jung-hee, which Professor Hwang just mentioned. And, making first person plural, I think in part making films came out of my early fascination as a young child with the moving image. My adoptive father was actually an amazing documentarian. He was a really great cinematographer using the 8mm film camera that he bought like in 1950. So he would, spend a lot of time taking home movies and editing it on his little edit machine. And then we would all watch his movies together as a family. And I just remember being fascinated by these movies, but also feeling quite a lot of despair and longing because his movies portrayed me in a particular way as a happy, carefree, assimilated child with absolutely no history, just a total blank slate who had just suddenly, popped into this family and was happy-go-lucky. And so I think part of my desire to make my first film, First Person Plural, was in some ways motivated by my desire to reinterpret his films and also tell my own version of my history and to be in control of the storytelling. So the film follows my meeting, my discovery of my Korean family, and also my American parents who agreed to come to Korea with me to meet them. And they traveled to Korea. And I think one of the most great experiences that we had together as a family with my parents is them going to Korea and meeting my Korean family. They recognized, they acknowledged their existence. They acknowledged their humanity. And I think they came to recognize that my Korean family had lost a daughter when I became a part of the Borshay family, and also that I had lost a family in becoming part of the family. So I think their acknowledgement and willingness to travel to Korea and meet my mother and brother and sisters gave me a kind of permission to grieve, which I had never really had before. And that gave me an opportunity to actually make room inside of my own heart to be able to embrace both families as my own. But meeting my Korean family didn't really answer questions about how I had been switched, who I had been switched with. And so I decided to make up a follow-up film called In the Matter of Cha Jung-hee, which chronicles the search for this mystery girl that I was supposed to be. And the film sort of, traverses the landscape of memory, amnesia, identity, and also uncovers the layers of deception that went into my own adoption, and the idea of looking at children and orphans as commodities that were that could be, transferred from one owner to another, so to speak. So I thought I'm going to show the trailer of that real quick in case people haven't seen it. It's very quick.
When I came to the United States, I arrived as Cha Jung-hee. My papers indicated that I was an orphan with no living family in Korea. But there was one problem. I wasn't really Cha Jung-hee. My parents were looking forward to the arrival of their newly adopted daughter, but at the last minute, Cha Jung-hee disappeared from the orphanage.
차정이가 마침 자기 부모가 나타나서 이제 그 우리한테도 말 없이 그 아이를 하루 밤에 데리고 가버렸어.
The social worker decided to send me in her place. She put my picture on her passport, and I was told not to reveal my true identity. Even today, her birth date is the one that appears on my driver's license and legal documents. She's a stranger who continues to be my legal identity. I've decided to go back to Korea to look for her. Thank you for searching for Cha Jung-hee. Yes, I'm searching for Cha Jung-hee, and I hope to find her. 여보세요, Cha Jung-hee 씨 계신가요? Oh, they published that picture. You kind of look like her.
아니지, 나는 눈이 동그래.
차정희 씨랑 우리 83명이 나왔어요.
왜요?
She's Cha Jung-hee?
Yeah.
Looks like her, right? I know in reality I am not her, but my sense of who I am has been held captive to her name and her identity. Who was this girl whose life I have lived?
So making, both of these very personal films was actually very healing. Someone once asked me, is it therapy making films? Actually, no, it's not therapy, but it did provide, both films provided an opportunity to explore these issues that, had been long inside of myself, but allowed me to express, I guess, internalized questions that I had long held. But as I've gotten older, I realized that adoption, I think when I was younger, I just thought that once I found my adopted, my Korean family, that everything would be okay and my questions would end. But in fact, it's not, adoption isn't something that you can fix. questions, don't end when a person finds their Korean family or their birth family. Adoption is really a lifelong journey that changes and becomes even more complicated in some ways as you get older, it turns out. I've also come to realize that there are aspects to our lives that really can't be understood or revealed solely through either therapy or meditation or personal effort, or in my case, making personal films, that at some point our personal reflections have to be understood and informed by a deeper understanding of the larger historical stage on which our experiences played out. So Geographies of Kinship, the film we're discussing today, is about stepping out into that territory to try to make sense of the Korean adoption experience from a larger perspective in a larger context. The film explores the history of transnational adoptions from Korea from the 1950s to not exactly present day, roughly present day. And interwoven with this history is the story of a handful of Korean adoptees from the US and Europe. And most importantly, the film explores how adoptees themselves begin to help shape policies that affect not only the adoptee community, but others affected by adoption, including single mothers and single original Korean families, while also calling for historical reckoning. So for those who haven't seen the film, I'm going to just play the trailer real quick.
I have no name, only the date when I was abandoned. I didn't look like my mother, I didn't look like my father, I didn't look like my brothers. The other kids would always think that I was Chinese.
Our parents told us we were orphans, that we didn't have any parents.
I knew I was Korean, but I didn't know what that meant.
The Korean War left thousands of children orphaned. The image in Western countries was that there's a continuous supply of Korean orphans.
If you're the illegitimate offspring of a Korean woman, you have no place. As far as the law was concerned, you didn't exist.
As the adoption rates from Korea hit their peak in the mid-'80s,
The majority of them were from single mothers.
My American parents were told they were getting orphans. But when I started to ask questions about my adoption, my mom just got up and she walked away.
자신을 떠나보낸 가족과 나라지만 해외 입양인들의 애타는 사연을 구용희 기자가 취재했습니다.
Many adoptees want to know what happened and how did it happen.
Yeah, Mommy, it's like looking in the mirror.
I feel very close with my family here, but I have this loss, and also I have this curiosity. I think it speaks volumes about us as humans, how we always want to go back.
It's a journey where I started to learn who am I.
I continue, as a filmmaker, I don't just make films about adoption, although I continue to make films about adoption. I'm working on yet another one about the first generation of Korean adoptees, mixed race adoptees who are searching for and many finding their original families, both in Korea and the US. But I've also been very interested in Korea, issues in Korea, in particular the Korean War. And the more I learn about Korean history and Korean War history, the more I realize that that Korean adoption, the Korean adoption history, and the experience of being divided from our families, our original families in Korea through adoption is really another manifestation of divided families in Korea through Korea's ongoing division and the unended war. And so I wanted to just show a short clip of this film called Memory of Forgotten War, which is about 4 Korean war survivors. And they're talking about being divided families. This is like 30 seconds.
The Korean War began on June 25th, 1950, but it had an origin going back decades.
I can still hear the sound, and then big clouds.
우리 가족이 다 노스 코리아 있었지. 완전히 세퍼레이트 된 거야.
그러니까 그 6.25 때 없어진 두 형제하고 너희들은 전혀 60 years still cannot see each other.
You know, I feel like the more I research and work with questions around the Korean War and adoption, the more I feel that the deeper, you know, we go into some of these stories and the interconnectedness between adoption, Korean immigration, the unended war. You know, I really feel like there are so many issues and questions that really may not be able to come to resolution until we have a permanent peace in Korea, and that we have some sort of resolution around the unended war, which is, I hope, something that we can all work toward together. That's it.
Great. Thank you, Director Borshay Lim, for this wonderful introduction to your films. Now we move on to Dr. Elana Kim for her discussion on the history of adoption and possibly a little bit about her book as well.
Thank you so much. It's hard to follow after Deanne because she's such an incredible speaker, resource, expert, and artist, but I'll do my best. It's a real pleasure to be here participating in this event. So I thank Professor Kim and Professor Hwang and everyone who made it possible for this event to take place. So I'm actually just going to speak very briefly about my research. I felt like the film does an excellent job of talking about the history of adoption, but I'm happy to answer questions about it if there are any during the Q&A. But before I begin, I want to first of all say that I'm not myself adopted. I'm a Korean American who was born to Korean immigrants to North America. But I started doing my research on Korean adoption when I was in graduate school and began the research in 1999 at a time when adult Korean adoptees were starting to emerge in public media, in public discourse in the US. And it's kind of like one of those things where once you start to pay attention to something, it seems like it's everywhere. So for me as a non-adopted Korean American, when I first learned about it, I was frankly just so shocked because I felt that I was someone who was pretty well aware of various aspects of Asian American history and Korean American history. And when I first learned about not just the fact of adoption, but the scale of the adoptions, that at that point, it was being stated that there were over 160,000 Korean children who've been adopted outside of Korea. Now we know that it's more like 200,000. But you know, the scale of this child migration was just so surprising, just on the face of it, but secondly, that I had never heard about it. So when I started to do the research and started meeting adult adopted Koreans, what became apparent was that there were some, like Deanne and other artists and filmmakers and some scholars who had been doing really foundational, fundamental research on this topic at a time when very few people were doing it. But for the most part, a lot of adoptees who I met didn't know this history. And it wasn't freely available. It was, you know, it wasn't being written about, it wasn't being talked about. And the information that did exist primarily came from adoption agencies. So my research started in 1999. I went to the first gathering conference, which took place in Washington, DC, and now is considered by many adult adoptees to be a kind of almost an origin point for what's now known as the global network of Korean adoptees. but it was really ground zero for developing what has now become a very vibrant, dynamic, global scale, transnational community of people who identify as Korean adoptees. And I started there to realize, number one, what it looked like for adult adoptees who had never met each other before, who had only met each other in very small groups, but to see themselves at that conference, there were over 400 who would come primarily from the US, but also from European nations. And for them to see that just the representation of that many of them together in the same space was mind-blowing. And for me as a researcher, it was a kind of unprecedented opportunity to watch a community in formation from the very beginning. So in my dissertation and in the book that I subsequently published, I talk about the emergence of this community as what I call a counterpublic, which is borrowing from some work in queer cultural studies. But it's really a way of looking at the agency of adult adoptees who were not only discovering their personal identities, their personal biographies, but also, much like the trajectory of Deann's filmmaking, trying also to understand who they are as individuals within a bigger history, but then also who they are as a collective within that history. And beyond that, the activist work that many adoptees started to engage with, some of them very radical in terms of speaking out against adoption as an industry, and others of them just mobilizing around the needs of adult adoptees in terms of peer counseling or community building and services in South Korea for people who are looking for Korean relatives. So all of those things are really unprecedented, and the counterpublic framework allowed me to really focus in on what changes, social changes, were being instituted by adoptees in the formation of these groups. Just one other thing I would say is that since I started doing, as I was doing my research in graduate school, I started to meet many other scholars who were also doing research, and many of whom were adopted from Korea as children or infants. And so I just want to point people towards this really amazing growing body of scholarship, much of which is written by adopted people, not just from Korea, and which together constitute what is now being called critical adoption studies. So this is also something that I think in the broader scheme of understanding this history of transnational adoption, and particularly transnational transracial adoption, we can see the emergence of this kind of critical scholarship as part of another extension of the community building and the activist work. So I'll end there. And as I said, I can do a capsule summary of adoption history, but I think I really encourage people to watch Deann's film. It does really an incredible job of synthesizing this history and connecting the various waves of adoption from Korea with the broader political, economic, and geopolitical history of Korea.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kim, for your illuminating sense of sort of the structures at work. And it was also really interesting to hear that adoptees themselves were hardly aware of this, the bigger forces that were, kind of shaping their lives in this very complex way. So, as you said, the film, I think, does a really great job of Geographies of Kinship, sort of, thinking about these geographical and temporal questions, and really going through the history of Korea and tracking the lives of these different sort of generations of adoptees. So I want to ask both of you, so in your sort of in your work with these, the adoptees, and in your interaction with them, among the different generations adoptees, were there any sort of changes as to how each envisioned their sort of a sense of belonging, either to their adoptive family or country, and also to their birth country and family? I'm guessing at least there must be at least some among the ones that you have interacted with who were less prone to engaging with their sort of the birth country or the birth family. Maybe we can start, well, either of you.
Elena, do you want to start, or do you?
I can just say briefly, or Deanne, did you have something on the tip of your tongue? I would just say that my sense is, I mean, first of all, I'd say that adoptees are really the experts on their own experience, and also in terms of all the circulating narratives and discourses. So one thing that has emerged over the years is this sense that sort of older adoptees who came immediately after the war and into the 60s have tended to perhaps be less critical of adoption as a system, in part because of, and I think Deanne's an exception to this, but in part because of, some of them were older, they had memories of hardship, and they also came to the US at a time where, American exceptionalism, American empire was on the rise. And so this idea of America as, the American dream and the almost the gift of having been, blessed with adoption was a very powerful discourse. And one could also argue that adoptees who came during later waves had different adoption histories. Many of them came as infants or very, very young children. And the circumstances in South Korea were very different. South Korea was at that point a little tiger nation, economically recognized as making huge leaps and bounds in terms of wealth and capitalism. And but the US was also a different place where, some of these adoptees who went to university and took courses in ethnic studies, or who, started to gain a more critical vantage point on American empire and American exceptionalism, started also to think about their own lives within those frameworks. So it doesn't mean that it was a smooth transition, but that, and many adoptees expressed the fact that they actually had more conflict because they were learning things about what it meant to be an Asian American in the US and about the US's role overseas, but also couldn't reconcile that with their personal adoption histories and their lives in their adoptive families. But I think one could argue that there has been this kind of progressive move among adoptees of various generations in terms of their critical attention to the structures of power.
Yeah, it's hard for me sometimes to step away from the personal stories that I've been hearing and am very involved in on this new project that I'm working on, and look at things from a bigger picture. So it makes it hard for me to sort of generalize, but I do think, based on my own experience and from the people that I'm currently in touch with, that the early generation, especially the mixed race adoptees who were among the first to arrive here, and I count myself, I guess, in kind of the earlier generation, but I think that this whole idea of, America as a melting pot, and you assimilate and become part of the family that you lived in, that America is the best country in the world. You wouldn't want to be anywhere else. Korea was this, terrible, tragic place. You don't want to think about the past. And so I think that there was this idea of, or this sort of thrust into, being American and identifying as American, and being, associated with your family and the community. I think in later decades, with the rise of, multiculturalism, I think there was a greater sense among the younger adoptees that were adopted in later years that it was possible to maybe hold a sense of dual culture to a degree, you know, that some of the adoptive parents would give their children like a middle Korean name or retain some of their original Korean name in their American name, and you know, go to culture camps and have access to some Korean culture and language and possibly Korean community through various efforts of you know, parents groups that were getting together to try to encourage their adopted children to get to know each other and learn Korean culture. And, you know, in speaking with some of those folks who attended like culture camps, I think those were important opportunities for Korean adoptees to meet each other and to create actually a sense of community and at least, you know, create a shared experience. And but I think that in general, you know, growing up in sort of, you know, if you're growing up isolated from other Asians or Asian Americans or Koreans, you know, it's a difficult thing to come to an understanding of one's history and oneself as a Korean American and Asian American. It's a sort of a daunting task, actually.
Thank you. This leads, I think, nicely into the next question that I had, which is the issue of assimilation, which you both briefly talked about in your responses just now. But I was particularly taken with the story of Taewon in Geographies of Kinship. And there were so many heartrending moments when he talked about his life as a Swede. And so in what ways do you think these overseas adoptees grapple with issues of assimilation? And often, you know, attending that are also issues and feelings of displacement and alienation. And I think, you know, this question has become really urgent more than ever today because of the recent really alarming surge of anti-Asian racism and violence that we've been witnessing. So if you can talk about how they grapple with these issues, and because as you know, we know a lot of these adoptees now are living or raised in largely white communities under white parents. And so if you can speak to that just a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think when I think about, you know, Daewon's story or Elana Kim in Sweden, you know, I think that, well, I mean, like my parents, actually, you know, I think the adoptive parents were told to just treat your kid like your own. And, you know, in Daewon's case, treat them like a Swiss kid or a Swedish kid or an American kid, and ignore any other questions around, you know, race or cultural, you know, disparities or whatnot. And I think, and I think that makes it tough. And I think in the current climate with the increased reports of anti-Asian violence, I think adoptees, you know, there are many adoptees that are kind of struggling to try to understand that from their own vantage point. And I think part of that is, you know, I think part of that is that Korean adoptees, the Asian American community, it's hard to say whether the Asian American community sees Korean adoptees as part of the larger Asian American community and vice versa. And also I think it's complicated by the fact that in some cases, adoptive families, well, you know, if you're growing up very racially isolated in a white family, a white community, that you may not have the language to talk about the racism that you're witnessing in your community or in the public at large, or even within your own family. And oftentimes, you know, among the adoptees I've spoken with, the adoptive families themselves have worldviews that are, you know, anti-Black, anti-Muslim, oftentimes anti-immigrant. And so this is kind of the worldview that some of us grow up in. And we tend to, I think, internalize, racism, see ourselves as different. And so it really complicates those, it complicates, I guess, how we respond to, what's happening today in terms of anti-Asian violence. But I also, there are some amazing adoptees who are very visible publicly, speaking about and doing incredible organizing. I was just listening to Stephanie Cho of Asian Americans for Justice in Atlanta. She's doing incredible work in Atlanta, and both in electoral politics and responding to the Atlanta shootings, and many others, and even here locally, I am part of a group that is been actively, discussing some of these issues and really trying to grapple with them as both Asian, Korean, and adopted individuals. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, it absolutely does. Thank you. Yeah.
I would just add that I think an adopted Korean scholar, Kim Park Nelson, conducted an oral history project with over 100 Korean American adoptees. And one of the things that she argues is that the colorblindness that characterized adoptive parent ideologies, probably up till now, right? This idea that adoptive family love, when it comes to transnational, transracial adoption, is colorblind, is actually probably the source of a lot of confusion and actually violence within adoptive families, precisely because it places the burden of disarticulating love and racism on the shoulders of adoptees themselves. So I think that at moments like this, with heightened anti-Asian violence, it can be very confusing for adoptees who have maybe never had a conversation with their parents about their experiences as racialized individuals in a racist society. And, but yet the circumstances almost, they're so disturbing that to not have the conversation, I think, would also be, as difficult as having the conversation. So that's one way of thinking about the effects of colorblindness in adoption, which at the time was certainly thought to be in the best interest of the child. But, listening to the stories of adoptees who have experienced things very differently, right? When we think about someone like Taewon in Switzerland, he created 2 lives. I mean, it's just amazing. Unbelievable, right? Yeah. And the resilience of him as a child, like 12 years old, to have well, first of all, I was thinking, I guess in Switzerland at that time, you could just tell your parents you're going off to the city and they would let you do that. But, regardless, his resilience and his resourcefulness, to find to craft his own identity, but also that he didn't have any space in his family to even bring it up, as a possibility. So, it's, I don't think it's, other adoptees have talked about similar ways in which they would, sort of discover Koreans in their communities at university or just in their neighborhood. And those would be kind of these precious moments where they might be able to develop a relationship to Korea just through that relationship, through those ties. But others also talk about really feeling unwelcome by Korean Americans or Asian Americans who viewed them as inauthentic, or who were confused by their racialization, and the ways in which they were enculturated as white. And so there's really been a lot of difficulties, and I think Deanne mentioned some of this, right, around the confusion about how to fit when all of the categories, the dominant categories that exist seem to exclude you.
Mhm. Yeah.
Oh, but I just want to add one other thing, which is to say that, you know, one of the amazing things about the, you know, communities that adoptees have formed is that it is, you know, that ends up producing what some adoptees would call Korean adoptee culture, right? So if you're not able to find yourself or to find acceptance in the existing social categories, then, you know, that's certainly one of the things that's emerged.
So my next question actually has to do with the adoptive parents and adoptive families themselves. So, you know, in Geographies of Kinship, we do get a very intimate and personal portrayal of the adoptees, but maybe not so much the adoptive families and the parents. But we do actually, in Deanne, your first directorial debut, which is the Geography, first person plural. Could you tell us a bit about how you, well, both you and Elena, as people work closely with the adoptee community as well, you know, understand this kinship that they form with the adoptive families and how that sense of kinship perhaps has evolved over time through the history of adoption?
Through the history of adoption. That's a good question. Well, I can speak to my own sense of kinship with my adoptive family. You know, as I said earlier, I think the adoption just, you know, first of all, this year actually I celebrated my 55th anniversary in this country. Isn't that just wild? Can't believe I've been here 55 years. And I still continue to, you know, deal with adoption. So it never goes away. And yet it does change. You know, I remember when when I first met my Korean family, my adoptive parents were struggling to understand their relationship with my Korean family. I remember my adoptive father describing it as an in-law relationship. You know, he basically said, oh, they're like our in-laws. And I thought that's perfect, you know, because our language, we don't have language to describe these two sets of parents that are really never supposed to meet, right, in this relationship. And I thought that's great. He's figured out a way to relate to my Korean family in a way that works for him and my mother. And but I think it, you know, it is complicated and changes over time. For example, I would have never imagined that. I continue to be surprised by this, actually. I have developed over the many years, a very close relationship with my Korean niece. She came and lived with us for 6 years as a young person and went to Berkeley and graduated and married. And now she lives only a mile from me. And she has three young kids who are just the love of my life. And, you know, I'm like their grandparent. And that was not something I could ever have predicted. And so there's, you know, these things that happen that I would have never expected. But I think in general, I feel like these kinship relationships are, you know, socially constructed. And I do think that the idea of an adopted child as kind of a property exclusively of one family that can then be transferred to another family, which is what adoption has been, I think that needs a radical rethinking. You know, I think it's not been beneficial actually for many of the parties involved. So yeah.
That's exactly where I was going to go, since I'm an anthropologist. And so certainly, you know, like the dominant frameworks by which we think about kinship are very much based on a social construction of the nuclear family as being the norm. And within that, children as property, as Deanne mentioned. So if you look at societies around the world that have had all sorts of different kinds of family structures, and what some anthropologists call child circulation. You know, there's fosterage, of course, there are always going to be children in need, yet this kind of radical separation of children from their natal families, and not just separation, but erasure of them is, you know, if you think about it, it's bizarre. Like, you know, we all are humans, we're all mammals, we come from other humans and have been nurtured to some extent by another human female. And to pretend like that never happened is, you know, if you were to think about an ideal society, I don't think that's something we would want to promote. And yet this has been the experience of so many adoptees domestically and internationally. So I think, you know, the idea of recrafting or revising how we construct personhood, and this is where the contradiction lies for a lot of adopted people, is on the one hand, adoption is considered to be unnatural, right? Because of this biological fetish that we have for who we are as being tied to biology. On the other hand, adoptees are being told that they're just like everyone else, they're normal. So that's already a fundamental contradiction that doesn't hold culturally, and yet adoptees are being asked to make this seem seamless. So again, I think that exposing all of the contradictions of adoption, you know, and then asking ourselves, how, like, what is in the best interest of a child? Is it presenting them with all these contradictions and asking them to reconcile them through isolation from other people like them? That, you know, it's clearly not working. So I think that's one of the ways in which we can understand assimilation, particularly of adoptees into American society, where these norms of the nuclear family and the separation of children from biological origins has been normalized.
Thank you. So my one last question deals with this sort of, you know, the kind of status of adoption in South Korea today. And the film, actually, one of the most wonderful things I felt was actually that you went all the way to the present day and showed, or near present day, and showed the activism. And Taewon and Jane Jung Tranka also, you know, as adoptees, being really involved actively in that scene, which was really heartening and empowering to watch. South Korea, you know, and it also shows the ways in which the government, South Korean government, has responded to the calls for sort of a more inclusive and open social system that can, you know, sort of provide these support systems for adoptees and future adoptees. But I think Korea today continues to grapple with issues that pertain to adoption, such as the stigma against single mothers and the baby box controversy. So what are your thoughts on these kind of ongoing issues and how they could be potentially addressed down the road?
You know, during the pandemic, I've been watching a lot of K-dramas, I admit, and and I've been noticing, this is my little anthropology here, I've been noticing how much the appearance of orphans and single mothers and deaths of parents appear repeatedly in these Korean dramas. And it's so fascinating thinking about it. I haven't quite figured out like what the pattern is, but it's clear if media is some indication of how a society is grappling with issues, you know, I think there's a long way to go. But it's kind of a fascinating thing to observe. You know, the film ends with Jane Trenka and Daewon talking about the citizenship law and also the special adoption law. And of course, things have changed quite a bit since that time because it's been a number of years. And I know that the Adoptee Solidarity Korea is you know, not active anymore. TRAC has not been as active since then. And different groups are, my understanding is different groups are sort of in formation right now. You know, the Korean adoptees who live in Korea long-term tends to change. And there's kind of a shift going on in terms of activist organizations working on issues there, it seems to me. Elena, you might have more details or more recent information, but I think that yes, the baby box, continues to be a controversy, which is really interesting to me. And there seems to be sort of resurgence in interest among some conservative lawmakers to revisit the special adoption law and go back to, the way it used to be before that law. And but I think there's also some interesting developments. Last year, Co-Root and some of the organizations, the single parent organizations, KUMFA, and other civil society organizations, in conjunction with adoptees, put together a conference called Adoption Truth Day, which was a replacement of, not a replacement, but it took the place of, I guess, of Single Mother's Day that used to happen in May. And I thought it was a really interesting conference. And I think that, that looks at issues around adoption that, because of the pandemic, it was made available globally to adoptees everywhere. And it's looking at questions around, false paperwork, some of the issues that adoptees have been dealing with in terms of trying to get access to records and so on. And there are some other organizations that are emerging. So I think, to me, it's exciting. I think there's lots of possibility in this sort of new period. But I don't live in Korea, and I haven't gone there in over a year. So I can't say that I have intimate knowledge of things happening on the ground there, but from the information that I get, I think there are some exciting things that are happening that will emerge in the coming months and years. Elena, do you have any other?
I was going to say, Deanne, I haven't been to Korea in a year either. I think it's for the same reason as you. But similarly, I think that I was very inspired by the Adoption Truth Day. I think that the question about adoptees' rights to an identity is one that should be protected, that is protected under the UN Convention for the Rights of the Child. And like Deanne's story of having been switched, a lot of other adoptees are finding really troubling irregularities, falsifications, lies in their adoption records that actually can make it. I mean, Deanne's story turned out differently because her birth family was able to locate her. But for other adoptees who only have those records and no clue for how to search for actual biological family, first family, because of the irregularity in the records, I think this is a real problem. And it's also a problem for adoptees who are domestic adoptees in Korea. The other thing I would just say is, the issue of adoption has always been tied to gender inequality. And if you look at, and Deanne's film talks about the fact that during the Cold War, Korea was spending over 40% of its budget on national defense and less than 2% on social welfare. But even today, if you look at South Korea's ranking among OECD nations, it's among the lowest in terms of social welfare funding, which obviously includes needy families and particularly women, single mothers. So, and in addition, it has one of the worst gender pay gaps in the world. So these are all part of the bigger picture of why adoption from Korea continues to exist. But one other thing that I think people don't often acknowledge is that South Korea is unique among nations in that it has never not had international adoption as part of a social welfare policy. And, one could argue maybe between 1948 and maybe 1951, it didn't, but, it's always had this option for dealing with needy children and dealing with the so-called problem of unwed motherhood. But what you see now is a convergence and confluence of different conservative forces in South Korea where, an anti-abortion project among lawmakers is converging with adoption, much as it does in the US. So I think, the attention should be, as adoptee activists in South Korea have focused on, is this question of gender equality, which includes access to birth control and access to sex education, all of those things. So that's kind of the bigger picture, I think.
Well, thank you so much, Deanne and Elena, for this really illuminating discussion. I think we can now move on to some questions from the audience. So the first one, I think, is for Deanne. Deanne, have you ever had any worries that making a film about switching exposes you to any repercussions by the US government? Do you think this fear inhibits people from discussing this issue of switching more broadly?
I didn't think about these until the Trump era.
Not surprising.
That's when I started to maybe have second thoughts. But, it's not something I worry about a lot. But I know I have been in touch with a couple of other adoptees who also have switched identities, and they've been very concerned about exposing their stories and because of possible deportation or whatnot. It's not something, it's interesting. I've been talking a bit with my niece, through whom I communicate with my Korean brother because of the language gap. And it turns out that my hojok is still existing in Korea as Kangokjin. So I suppose if I was deported as Deanne Borshay, I could go back and become Kangokjin. So I don't know. It's a strange life.
So the next one is for Elena. What topics involving Korean adoption do you feel now, today, perhaps needs more illumination?
Well, ironically, Deanne mentioned deportation. That is certainly one thing that requires some attention, I think. And I have been collaborating with adoption scholar Kim Park Nelson on some of these questions related to the issue of adoptees without citizenship, which includes adoptees from all over the world who came to the US before the Child Citizenship Act was signed into law in 2000 and were left without citizenship because they were over the age of 18 when that law was signed and they had never been naturalized. So this is a real issue that I think seems as if it could be a very easy fix in the US Congress, but for whatever reasons, many of which are connected to a conservative perspective on immigration, it hasn't been resolved. And in a way, it connects to the question about switching and US government involvement, because some of the research that Kim Park Nelson and I have done shows that because of a lack of oversight by the US State Department during the height of adoptions from Korea, many children were allowed into the country with false identification. They came in as different people. And so it's not just a question of how they will now connect with any Korean relatives who also might be trying to find them, but it's this issue of a lack of oversight in which the US government essentially permitted unethical and possibly illegal adoptions.
Okay, so the next question says, thank you so much for this amazing film. I have 3 questions. 1, how long did it take Deanne to make this film? And 2,
Forever. I'm kidding.
Yeah, and what challenges it came up while you were making this film? And 3, we noticed that you interviewed Molly Holt. As more and more scholarship has been produced on transnational, transracial adoption, the role of agencies like Holt Adoption Services has been questioned as partaking in the wholesale migration and profit off of children. Considering, or profit of children, considering your own position as an adult adoptee, what is your thinking on this topic and in interviewing Molly Holt? Was interviewing her easy or difficult?
Okay, so how long did it take to make the film? It did take forever. It took a long time. And you know, a lot of that time was fundraising. It takes a really long time to fundraise for films. And also the research process took a really long time. But I finished it, so I'm very happy that it's done. Some of the challenges, you know, I think the main challenge for me in making the film was trying to find a balance between telling the history and the personal stories, and trying to make sure that there was, that first of all, that there was interconnection between the two, and that it was fairly, you know, smooth and natural in terms of storytelling. But also I wanted to stay true to both the individuals, individual personal stories and their experiences, along with the historical material. So that took actually a long time. And I was very lucky to have Elana as both on camera and as an advisor on the film. I had actually a wonderful group of advisors who, you know, adoptee and non-adoptee advisors who have done incredible work in history and anthropology and adoption studies. So I was very, I felt much gratitude to the support that I received. In terms of Molly's interview, it's an interesting question. You know, Molly, it's an interesting question. I have known Molly for many years, and see, how can I answer this? You know, Molly is, I guess, has been a polarizing figure, to put it honestly. And Holt, of course, has also, you know, some controversy around, a lot of controversy around Holt. And, but I think with Molly, you know, there are adoptees who really revere Molly and felt that she was kind of the godmother of adoption, and that you know, would visit her and, you know, and just pay a lot of respect, you know, to her and the Holt family. There are also a lot of adoptees who had very negative experiences at Holt, and especially in the post-adoption process and search process. And you know, Holt was handled the most number of Korean children to the US and other parts of the world. And but you know, I think in the film, I felt like I had an understanding of Molly, I guess, and I could see her humanity. We disagreed on most everything. I felt like in some ways her worldview was very much in the 1950s, kind of, it's kind of, you know, 1950s evangelical, Western sort of, you know, worldview. And we had very differing politics. But we found a way to talk to each other. I interviewed her a number of times actually, and filmed her. I recently filmed, not recently, but before she passed away, I filmed her a couple of times with mixed race adoptees whose cases she had handled actually in the early years, and who were returning and meeting with her. So I think she felt like, although we disagreed, that I didn't attack her when I was interviewing her. In fact, she said that actually after one of the interviews, that she was happy that I didn't attack her. And So, I think that for the film, I didn't, there was Oksun Hong that I interviewed in Mali. And I think those were the two folks that were involved in the early years that I decided to actually incorporate briefly. And, I don't know what to say except that I wanted to include that, and for the community that might see this film to just to be able to interpret it in the way that they interpret it. I don't know if that makes any sense.
So the next question is for Elena. Elena, do you ever plan to write another full book about Korean adoption? Do you feel that there is undiscovered adopted territory which could or should be covered in a sequel?
I don't know. I'm sure there are many other spaces in which adoptees are producing work, but in a way, I really feel like the future is with this next generation of scholars, many of whom are adopted and who have just incredible perspectives and insights. And I'm doing, like I mentioned, I am doing a collaboration with Kim Park Nelson on the issue of deportation, and I'm still very kind of curious and kind of a fellow traveler in all of this. I don't know if I have a second book about it, but certainly I don't, I think I will continue to publish in this area. But more than my own research, I'm really enthused and excited about other scholarship that's coming out. But because Deanne was talking about Molly Holt, I just wanted to say that in my experience with her, and this I think corroborates what Deanne is saying, she was, and I think this could be frustrating for some adoptees, because she was completely unapologetic about her views, which were very solidified, or I think in my sense, around her early experiences in Korea at that time. So she could always hold on to this idea that adoptees today could never understand what the circumstances were like in Korea. But I also got the sense that she carried over this kind of culturalist notion about Koreans and Korean beliefs into the present. And so she was, she could be extremely open. I remember when I went to meet with her, she was extremely open about showing me all sorts of documents and being, talking about it. Perhaps because she didn't feel like she was being interrogated or attacked by me either, but but I think the openness had to do with the fact that she was like, I've done nothing wrong. It was all for the good of the children and for Korea, and she had no, she was not apologetic, as I said. So that was part of her personality, certainly, and her belief.
No, it's amazing, because you ended up answering my one question that I had is, as your work as a documentarist and an anthropologist, you have to somehow also build relationship with your interviewees and your subjects. And, there's so much, I think, that goes on behind the scenes, where, there's this kind of push and pull, a lot of push and pull factors about how you approach these subjects, and, how you should be handling them as yet another human being. But, when your own worldview or their worldview is just simply disagree with yours on so many levels, how do you sort of reconcile that? So yeah, thank you for sharing these fascinating accounts. The next question is, how would you compare the Korean American adoption history that you both document so powerfully in your work with the Chinese American adoptions that took off in the 1990s? My sense is that this latter trend also has involved some of the questionable adoption practices you document in Korea, but adopting primarily white parents of Chinese daughters seem more willing to acknowledge their children's racial and cultural difference from them, and to cultivate some exposure to Chinese culture. Do you have a sense of what, if anything, has changed?
You know, I think that when I released First Person Plural, and also in the matter of Cha Jung-hee, there was tremendous support of the film from families with children from China. There was incredible interest on the part of adoptive parents, primarily white adoptive parents, with their to learn as much as they could from the Korean adoption experience for their Chinese children, primarily daughters. And it was really interesting because I think a lot of the parents and I were the same age at the time. And I was also raising a kid, and they're raising their adopted children. And fascinating to listen to their concerns and interests and their strategies for learning from the Korean adoptee experience, you know, and deciding to try different things, like sending their kids to Chinese immersion language school, going to China as much as they can, doing early searches for their, you know, biological family, and so on. So, so I feel like that community, yeah, it had sort of a different experience in some ways, but I think in other ways, you know, having met Chinese adult adoptees, a number of them, you know, there's still questions around identity, family search, you know, a lot of things that Korean adoptees have experienced. But I think that many, I don't know, actually, I don't know what the percentage is in terms of how many Chinese adoptees learn, you know, fluent Mandarin, or, you know, I don't know, but the folks that I have interacted with, a number of them are fluent, you know, and go back to China and have become very active in actually doing things like DNA searches for, you know, their birth families and so on. So it's an interesting phenomenon.
Elena?
Oh, I would just add that at least when I was doing my research, beginning in the late 90s, early 2000s, as Deanne mentioned, you know, there was adult adoptees coming into this kind of collective consciousness, and parents of children from China. And so they would end up in the same spaces, largely, sometimes coordinated by adult adoptees themselves, sometimes by adoption agencies. And the conflicts were quite interesting because the parents with children from China, or family, the FCC groups, were tended to have this view that they were very progressive because they were attuned to the multicultural ways in which they needed to expose their children to Chinese culture and things. But the tendency was to frame themselves generationally as different from the parents of adult Korean adoptees, who were less cosmopolitan and less kind of, although woke wasn't in the vocabulary then, less woke around questions of culture. But the adoptees would then counter that, in fact, the parents were not attuned to the real problem, which was racial difference. And that if they couldn't just replace an attention to racialization with an attention to culture, that was just papering things over. It's kind of soft multiculturalism. So I think, but what I see now is, you know, certainly I think a lot of the parents of that generation took lessons from adult adoptees who were trying to send this message about the importance of racial difference in the socialization of their children. But certainly I've also met adults, Chinese adoptees whose parents did not learn those lessons and who had to kind of navigate it themselves. So the reproduction of some of these challenges for transracial, transnational adoptees continues. And there have been, you know, there's one Chinese adoptee who I've met who's been very active in networking with Korean adoptees. So I think that, you know, this sense of generational transference is happening. And lastly, I just note, I'm very curious about this phenomenon where when Chinese adopted daughters were increasing in numbers in the US, so were Korean adopted sons, because that was a point in time where there were fewer children available for adoption from Korea, generally speaking, and the push by the government to encourage domestic adoption in Korea resulted in more Korean parents wanting to adopt daughters. So boys would tend to be sent overseas adoption over girls. So demographically, it's interesting to me that you'll have, you know, gender-wise at least, Korean adopted sons and Chinese adopted daughters.
Thank you. So I think we have time for one last question. It says, hi, Director Borshay Lim and Dr. Kim. Thanks so much for your great sharing. I have a question for both of you in Geographies of Kinship. It is mentioned that cross-racial adoption between African/Native Americans and white Americans was frowned upon, yet Asian kids were adopted as if they had no racial or cultural identities. Would you please say something about this assumed absence of racial identity and Asian Americans as model minorities?
I'm not sure if I understand the question fully. Let me read it in the chat. Who is it from?
It's from Ning Hwang.
Okay. Elena, do you want to?
Yeah, I think that the section in the documentary that covers this is very well done, in that it shows the controversies over the adoptions of Native Americans and African American children by whites at the very same time that adoptions from Korea were increasing exponentially. And a sociologist, Sarah Doro, who wrote a book about Chinese adoptions, mentions this way in which African American children were framed as unredeemable in some way, that especially boys, that they were seen as risky for white parents to adopt, whereas the model minority myth, particularly when applied to girls, Asian girls, was heightened their value. So in other words, the adoption industry, for, you know, whether intentionally or not, created a kind of implicit hierarchy of race and gender. And parents would oftentimes calculate the risk in terms of raising children transracially. You know, I think implicit in that is who is more assimilable to dominant white society and the cultural values associated with that. So I think that's getting at what the question is asking about.
You know, I in thinking about that period, I've often wondered about why, you know, there were concerns expressed by, like, the Black social workers of America and Native American community around adoption of Black and Native American children by white families, and yet there wasn't any, you know, clamoring by the Asian American community to protest the adoption of the large number of Korean children. But, you know, at the time there wasn't there was a growing Asian American community. There were the Koreans who were in the United States at the time. You know, there were large numbers. There were actually military brides and adoptees. And post 1965 immigration law changes, you know, an emerging Korean community. But in looking at that period, I realized that most of the Asian American community were Japanese American or Chinese American, and that I don't think there was much of a connect in terms of questions or interest in Korean children being adopted by white families. I guess that's my response to that question. I'm not sure if I answered that.
And I do think, just to reiterate what Elena pointed out, the film actually does a very good job of pointing out how the carryovers of the racial racial hierarchy occurs in adoption in the U.S. as well. So yeah, thank you for your responses. Okay, so that is unfortunately all the time that we have for tonight. Thank you so much again to Director Borshay Lim and Dr. Kim for such thought-provoking discussion and really illuminating responses to questions. I also want to thank all those in the audience today for attending the webinar and for raising a lot of important questions for our speakers. And I'm really sorry that we couldn't get to more, not even half of them actually. So the webinar will actually be made available tomorrow on YouTube for anyone who was unable to make it to tonight's webinar. So on that note, we'll be closing for the evening. Thank you again, everyone, and especially to our two wonderful speakers for tonight.